It was a quiet night at a small roadside bar, the kind of place most people would pass without a second glance. Dim lights hung low from the ceiling, casting soft shadows across worn wooden tables. A slow country song played in the background, barely loud enough to notice. A few regulars sat scattered around, sipping their drinks, minding their own business. Nothing felt unusual, nothing felt out of place. Behind the counter, the bartender moved with quiet efficiency, wiping down glasses, refilling orders, offering polite nods to familiar faces. He wasn't loud, wasn't flashy, just someone doing his job, trying to get through another long shift. At the far end of the bar, a man sat alone. Dressed simply, almost too simply for someone of his presence. No attention drawn to him, no loud voice, no unnecessary movement, just calm, still, observant. He hadn't said much since he walked in, just ordered his drink and kept to himself. Most people didn't notice him, but if they had looked closely, they might have recognized Steven Seagal sitting there quietly, watching everything without appearing to. For a while, the night stayed peaceful. Glasses clinked softly, a chair scraped against the floor, someone laughed faintly in the corner. It was the kind of calm that makes you believe nothing is about to go wrong. Until the door suddenly swung open. The sound cut through the room like a warning. A man walked in, loud, unsteady, carrying an energy that didn't belong in a place like this. His boots hit the floor harder than necessary. His voice followed right behind, already raised, already demanding attention. A few heads turned. The bartender glanced up just for a second, and then looked back down, continuing his work. But something had already shifted. The air didn't feel the same anymore. The calm was gone, replaced by a tension no one could quite explain yet. Because in moments like this, it's never about how things start. It's about how far they're about to go. The man who had just walked in didn't belong to the quiet rhythm of the place. You could feel it instantly. His presence was loud, not just in sound, but in attitude. He moved like the room owed him something, like every person inside was already beneath him. He dragged a chair back roughly and dropped into it near the center of the bar. The legs scraped loudly against the floor, breaking whatever calm remained. A few customers exchanged glances, but quickly looked away. No one wanted trouble. Behind the counter, the bartender kept his composure. He had seen all kinds of people come through these doors, tired workers, travelers, regulars looking to unwind, and sometimes men like this, men who came in not for a drink, but for control. Still, he didn't react. He simply walked over, calm and professional. "What can I get you?" he asked politely. The man didn't answer right away. He leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the room as if judging it. Then he looked up at the bartender with a smirk that didn't sit right. "About time," he muttered. "Thought this place didn't have any service." The bartender ignored the tone. "What would you like to drink, sir?" "Something strong, and make it worth my time." There was a slight pause, but the bartender nodded and turned to prepare the order. His movements stayed steady, controlled. No irritation, no reaction. At the far end of the counter, Steven Seagal sat quietly, his gaze lowered toward his glass, but he was listening, every word, every shift in tone. His stillness wasn't indifference, it was awareness. The drink was placed in front of the man without a word. He picked it up, looked at it, then took a slow sip. For a brief second, it seemed like things might settle. But then he scoffed. "This," he said loudly, "this is what you call strong?" A few people glanced over again. The bartender remained calm. "If you'd like something different, I can—" Before he could finish, the man cut him off. No, he said, waving his hand dismissively. "I get it. This place isn't exactly high class." The insult hung in the air. Still, the bartender didn't respond. He simply reached for the glass. "I can remake it for you," he said. But the man pulled it back. "Did I say you could touch it?" Now the tension was undeniable. One of the regulars shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Another quietly placed cash on the table, preparing to leave. The mood had changed completely. And yet, at the far end of the bar, Steven didn't move. Not yet.
He simply lifted his glass slightly, taking a slow sip, eyes calm, posture relaxed, watching, waiting. Because moments like this didn't need immediate action. They needed the right moment. And something about this situation made it clear that moment was getting closer.
The tension didn't explode all at once. It built slowly, like pressure rising in a sealed room. The man took another sip of his drink, then slammed the glass down harder than necessary. The sharp crack echoed through the bar, drawing every eye back to him. "This is garbage," he said loudly. "You don't even know how to pour a proper drink." The bartender remained steady. "I can make you another one, sir." But the man wasn't interested in solutions. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter, his voice dropping just enough to sound more personal, more targeted. "Or maybe you just don't care," he added. "Maybe this is the best you can do." A few people shifted in their seats again. The discomfort in the room was growing heavier by the second. The bartender kept his tone respectful. "I'm just trying to help." That only made things worse. The man laughed under his breath, shaking his head. "Help?" he repeated. "You call this help?" He picked up the glass again, staring at it like it offended him. Then, without warning, he pushed it forward, letting it spill across the counter. Liquid spread toward the bartender's hands, dripping off the edge. A quiet gasp came from somewhere in the room. That wasn't an accident. That was intentional. The bartender paused for just a second, looking at the mess, then reached for a cloth to clean it up. Still no anger, still no reaction. But now the disrespect was clear, and it wasn't stopping. "You're going to clean that up, right?" the man said, leaning back again. "Or is that too much for you too?" The bartender nodded once. "I'll take care of it." From the far end of the bar, Seagal slowly set his glass down. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it mattered, because it was the first sign that his attention had shifted from passive observation to quiet focus. His eyes lifted slightly, not directly staring, but aware, calculating. The man at the center of the room didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care. He was too busy enjoying the control. "You know what your problem is?" he continued, louder now. "You don't have any backbone." The words landed harder than the spilled drink. One of the customers muttered something under his breath. Another shook his head, clearly uncomfortable. But no one stepped in. No one wanted to become the next target. The bartender wiped the counter carefully, his movements still controlled, but slower now, measured. He was holding his patience together piece by piece. "I'm just doing my job," he said quietly. The man leaned forward again, his smirk returning. "Yeah, then maybe you should do it better." And then he did something that crossed a line you don't come back from. He reached out and shoved the bartender's hand away. Not hard enough to cause damage, but more than enough to show disrespect. The room went silent, completely silent. Even the music in the background seemed to fade into nothing. That was the moment everything changed. At the end of the bar, Stephen didn't move right away, but this time he didn't look away either, because now it wasn't just tension anymore. It was a situation. And situations like this only go one of two ways. Either someone walks away, or someone steps in. And the way things were unfolding, it was becoming clear that walking away was no longer an option. For a moment, no one moved. The silence in the bar felt heavy, like the air itself was waiting to see what would happen next. The bartender slowly pulled his hand back, not reacting, not escalating. His face remained calm, but there was something different now, something tighter, more controlled. He wasn't just dealing with a rude customer anymore. This had crossed into something else. "Sir, there's no need for that." He laughed, a short, sharp laugh filled with arrogance. "No need?" he repeated. "I'll decide what there's a need for." He leaned forward again, closer this time, invading the bartender's space deliberately. "You work here, right? Then act like it." The bartender didn't respond. And that silence, that restraint, only seemed to irritate the man more. Without warning, he grabbed the edge of the glass still sitting on the counter and flung what was left of the drink forward. It splashed across the bartender's shirt. A few drops hit the counter, some dripped to the floor, but most stayed right there, soaking into the fabric. The room reacted instantly.
A chair shifted loudly, someone cursed under their breath, another person stood up halfway, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. This wasn't just disrespect anymore. This was humiliation. The bartender froze for just a second, not out of fear, but out of disbelief. Still, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't push back, he didn't even step away. He just stood there, absorbing it. And that's when a chair moved. Not loudly, not aggressively, just enough to be heard. At the far end of the bar, Steven Seagal finally stood up, slowly, calmly. No sudden movements, no dramatic gestures, but the shift was immediate. People noticed. The man at the counter didn't, not yet, but others did. Eyes turned. Conversation stopped completely. Steven took a few steps forward, his pace steady, controlled. There was no anger on his face, no visible frustration, just focus. The kind of focus that doesn't need to prove anything. He stopped a few feet behind the man, close enough to be heard, far enough to avoid escalation. Leave him alone. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The kind of tone that didn't ask for attention, it commanded it. The man paused mid-motion, the arrogance on his face flickering for just a second. Then he turned slowly in his chair, looking up, sizing him up. And for the first time since he walked in, someone had interrupted his control. The room held its breath, because now it wasn't just about a bartender anymore. It was about what happens when the wrong person gets involved.
The man turned fully in his chair, eyes narrowing as he looked up at the one who had just spoken. For a second, he didn't say anything. He just studied him, from the calm posture to the steady gaze to the complete lack of fear. Then he smirked. "Or what?" he said, leaning back slightly. "You gonna make me?" The room stayed silent. Every person inside could feel it now. This wasn't just an argument anymore. This was the moment everything would either calm down or spiral completely out of control. Steven Seagal didn't react to the tone. He didn't step closer. He didn't raise his voice. "I'm asking you to stop," he said calmly. "That's all." The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, I don't think I will." He pushed himself up from the chair, standing now, trying to match Steven's presence with his own. But there was a difference. One was controlled, the other unstable. "You think you can just walk up and tell me what to do?" he continued. "You don't even know me." Steven's expression didn't change. "I don't need to," he said. That answer hit harder than an insult. The man's smile faded slightly. And just like that, the tension snapped tighter. "Listen," the man said, stepping closer now, closing the distance deliberately. "This doesn't concern you, so why don't you go back to your seat before you regret it?" A few people in the bar shifted, some standing up slowly, others pulling out their phones without making it obvious. Something was about to happen. Steven glanced briefly toward the bartender. The man was still standing there, silent, shirt damp, hands resting lightly on the counter. Then Steven looked back. "This concerns me now," he said. The man exhaled sharply through his nose, irritated. "You really don't get it, do you?" he muttered. And then he made his move. Fast, but reckless. He reached forward, grabbing at Steven's shirt, trying to pull him off balance. But it didn't work. Not even for a second. Steven's reaction was immediate, but controlled. He didn't strike. He didn't swing. Instead, he shifted slightly to the side, letting the man's momentum carry forward, and calmly redirected his arm downward with a firm grip. It was quick, efficient, almost effortless. The man stumbled a half step, caught off guard more than hurt. "What the?" He tried again, this time with more force, frustration clearly taking over. But again, nothing landed. Steven moved just enough to stay out of reach, guiding the motion away without escalating it. There was no panic in his movements, no aggression, just precision. "Don't do that," Steven said quietly. But the man wasn't listening anymore. Embarrassment had taken over. The crowd, the silence, the fact that nothing he did was working. It all built into one thing: anger. "Stand still," he snapped, lunging forward again. This time, Steven didn't step back. He stepped in.
A small shift, barely noticeable, but it changed everything. In one smooth motion, he controlled the man's arm, turned his position, and applied just enough pressure to stop him completely. No slam, no dramatic throw, just control. The man froze, not because he wanted to, but because he couldn't move. A quiet gasp spread through the bar. Phones were fully out now, recording, capturing every second. Stephen leaned slightly closer, his voice still calm. "I told you to stop." The man struggled for a second, then realized it wasn't working. The strength he expected to overpower wasn't there. Instead, he was stuck, controlled without being hurt, dominated without being attacked, and that was worse. Because now, everyone could see it. The confidence he walked in with was gone, replaced by something else: uncertainty. For the first time that night, he wasn't in control anymore, and everyone in the room knew it. For a moment, everything stood still. The man's arm was locked in place, not painfully, but firmly enough to remind him he wasn't going anywhere. His breathing grew heavier, uneven now, the confidence he walked in with completely gone. Around them, the bar had transformed. Chairs were pushed back, conversations had stopped, every eye was fixed on the center of the room, and almost every hand held a phone, recording, capturing every second. Steven Seagal didn't tighten his grip. He didn't show off. He didn't say anything unnecessary. He just held the position, calm, steady, giving the man a choice. "Relax," Steven said quietly, "and this ends." The man clenched his jaw, trying to pull free again. It didn't work, not even slightly. A murmur spread through the crowd. "Did you see that? He didn't even hit him. How was he holding him like that?" The whispers weren't loud, but they were enough. Enough for the man to hear, enough to make the situation worse for him. Because now it wasn't just about losing control, it was about losing face. "Let go of me," he snapped, his voice no longer as strong as before. Stephen didn't respond immediately. He simply watched him for a second, measuring, waiting. Then, slowly, he released him. No shove, no force, just a clean step back, hands visible, posture relaxed. The man staggered slightly as his arm came free, quickly regaining his balance. He looked around, realizing what had just happened. The phones, the eyes, the silence, all of it pointed at him. "You think this is funny?" he barked, turning toward the crowd now, trying to redirect the attention. No one answered. That silence hit harder than any words. Behind the counter, the bartender stood still, watching, unsure whether to step in or stay out of it. His earlier humiliation was still visible, but now something else had replaced it: relief. The man turned back toward Stephen, his anger now mixed with embarrassment. "You don't know who you're messing with." But the threat felt weaker now. Stephen's expression didn't change. "I don't need to," he replied. That calm response, again, stripped away whatever was left of the man's dominance. A phone from the corner lifted higher. Someone whispered, "That's Steven Seagal. I think it is." Another voice followed, louder this time. "No way. It is him." Recognition spread quickly. Faces changed, eyes widened. The atmosphere shifted again, but not in the man's favor. Because now, the person he tried to overpower wasn't just calm, he was someone known for exactly this kind of control. The man hesitated just for a second, but it was enough. That hesitation said everything. "You should leave," Stephen said calmly. No threat, no aggression, just a statement, the kind that didn't need to be repeated. The man looked around one more time, at the crowd, at the phones, at the bartender, then back at Stephen. For a moment, it seemed like he might say something else, try to regain control one last time, but he didn't. Instead, he scoffed under his breath, shaking his head like none of this mattered. "Whatever," he muttered. He grabbed his jacket roughly from the chair, knocking it slightly as he did. The sound echoed louder than it should have. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Not confidently, not proudly, but quickly, like someone trying to leave before things got worse. The door swung open again and then shut behind him. Just like that, he was gone. The tension didn't disappear instantly. It lingered for a few seconds, hanging in the air as everyone processed what they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, the room exhaled. A chair moved. Someone let out a quiet laugh of disbelief. Another lowered their phone, shaking their head. No way that just happened. Behind the counter, the bartender finally spoke. "Thank you," he said quietly. Stephen looked at him, gave a small nod. No one deserves that. Simple, direct, final. The power in the room had completely shifted, not through violence, not through chaos, but through control. And everyone there knew they had just witnessed something rare. Not just a confrontation, but a moment where respect was restored, without losing control.
For a few seconds after the door shut, no one spoke. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from fear anymore, but from processing. What just happened didn't feel real, not because it was dramatic, but because of how controlled it was. Slowly, the bar began to come back to life. A chair scraped softly against the floor. Someone cleared their throat. A couple of people exchanged looks, still half in disbelief. Phones lowered one by one, though a few were still pointed forward, capturing the final moments. Behind the counter, the bartender stood still for a second longer, then reached for a clean towel. He wiped his hands first, then the counter, then paused again, like he was grounding himself. "You okay?" someone asked from the corner. He nodded. "Yeah, I'm good." But his voice carried something deeper than just relief. It carried understanding, because he knew how differently that could have ended. At the center of it all, Seagal had already stepped back to where he had been sitting before. No attention-seeking, no dramatic exit. He simply picked up his glass again, taking a calm sip like nothing extraordinary had just happened. But everyone knew better. One of the regulars stood up and walked closer. "Man, that was something," he said, shaking his head. "You handled that different." Stephen looked at him briefly. "Didn't need to be anything else," he replied. The man let out a quiet laugh. Most people would have lost it. Stephen placed his glass down. "That's usually what makes things worse," he said. There was no lecture in his tone, no attempt to sound wise, just a simple truth. The bartender stepped out from behind the counter now, adjusting his shirt slightly where the drink had soaked through earlier. He hesitated for a moment, then walked over. "I appreciate that," he said. "Really." Stephen nodded once. "You kept your composure," he replied. "That matters." The bartender gave a small, almost uncertain smile. "Didn't feel like it in the moment," he admitted. "It never does," Stephen said. A few people nearby listened closely now, not recording, just listening, because the tension had turned into something else, something reflective. "You know," one of them said, "that could have gone bad real fast." Stephen didn't disagree. "It almost did," he said. He leaned back slightly in his chair, eyes calm, voice steady. "The problem isn't anger. Everyone feels that. The problem is what you do with it." The room stayed quiet again, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was focused. The bartender nodded slowly, absorbing the words. "Guy like that," he said, glancing toward the door. "You can't reason with him." Stephen looked in the same direction for a brief moment. "No," he said, "but you can control how far it goes." That line stayed in the air, simple, clear, powerful. Near the entrance, someone replayed a clip on their phone, showing the exact moment the man had been stopped without a single punch thrown. "Look at this," he whispered to his friend. "He didn't even try to hurt him." Another voice added, "That's what makes it crazy." Because it was. In a world where most confrontations explode into chaos, this one didn't. It ended with control, respect restored without violence. The bartender returned behind the counter, finishing cleaning the last of the spilled drink. His movements were steadier now, more confident, like something had shifted for him too. Not just relief, but perspective. As the minutes passed, the bar slowly returned to normal. Drinks were served, conversations picked back up, but the energy wasn't the same as before.
It was calmer, more aware, like everyone had taken something from what they had just seen. Stephen finished his drink and stood up once more. This time there was no tension attached to the movement, just a quiet decision to leave. He reached into his pocket, placed cash on the counter, more than enough to cover everything. The bartender noticed. "You don't have to," he started. "It's fine," Stephen said. Then he paused for a second, not for attention, not for effect, just long enough to leave one last thought. Respect isn't something you demand, it's something you show. The bartender nodded, and this time there was no hesitation in it. "Yeah, I get that now." Stephen gave a final nod, then turned toward the door. As he walked out, no one stopped him, no one followed, they just watched. Not because he was famous, but because of what he represented in that moment. Control, discipline, restraint. The door opened, then closed behind him, and just like that, he was gone. But the moment stayed, not in the noise, not in the confrontation, but in the way it ended. Because strength doesn't always need to prove itself loudly. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is stay in control when everything around them is pushing for the opposite. And that night, in a small roadside bar, everyone there learned something they wouldn't forget anytime soon. Respect matters, control matters, and sometimes walking away with dignity is the real victory.